Okay, everybody, this is where we left off with chapter one. We were talking about all these different scientists and doctors and microbiologists who have made significant contributions to microbiology. So, our next very important person that we're going to talk about is Edward Jenner. So, Edward Jenner actually predates a lot of the people that we actually talked about before. So, we talked about Louis Pasteur, we talked about Robert Koch, and we actually have to take a step back now because now we're going back to the late 1700s, which predates Pasteur by about 60 years or so, 60 to 80 years. So Edward Jenner was just a very kind of small town doctor. One of those kind of like old school country doctors in England. And he had a lot of patients who were milkmaids. So milkmaids were usually young women who made money by milking cows. So they would kind of go like farm to farm and milk cows and get paid to do it. And a lot of them would get a disease called cowpox. And cowpox was kind of similar to, like, I guess you could say measles. It wasn't, really, really fatal. I mean, definitely it was a disease that, you had to get better from, and it would take several weeks. But normally, people who were young and healthy, if they got cowpox, they would be fine. They would recover and they would be okay. But he noticed that all of those patients that had gotten better from cowpox would never get smallpox. And smallpox was actually one of the most devastating, deadly diseases known to man at the time. Smallpox had been an issue for hundreds and hundreds of years. Smallpox was one of the main diseases that were brought over from Europe by the European explorers and killed lots and lots of Native Americans because smallpox did not exist in the New World, so they didn't have any immunity to it or anything, and it killed a lot of Native American populations in the 16 and 1700s because of just how deadly a disease it is. It's very, very bad disease. So Dr. Jenner noticed that the patients who got better from cowpox never got smallpox. And he thought to himself, well, that's very interesting. They must have something in them that is allowing them to not get this disease. So what he did, something that, nowadays, if a doctor tried to do something like this, they would be arrested immediately. But what he did is he actually took some blood and fluid from those patients who had gotten better from cowpox, and he actually injected it into other patients. And it was actually mostly children that he did this to. And he did it because he felt as though he was protecting them from smallpox. And it worked. And that's what was really kind of mind blowing at the time. Is he basically put up posters around the town, and he said, if you want to protect yourself and your children from smallpox, come see me, and I'll give you this injection, and you won't get smallpox. So of course people were like, oh yeah, absolutely. So there was stories about lines going for, blocks and blocks of people just waiting their turn to go see Dr. Jenner, so that they would not get smallpox. And what ended up happening is, the majority of all these people basically got cowpox, so they still got sick, but they got better, and they never ever got smallpox. Now, this essentially became known as the first vaccine. Now, Dr. Jenner had no idea why this worked, okay? He didn't call it a vaccine. He just knew that if he injected people with this fluid or blood from the cowpox patients, he knew that it protected them from smallpox. And he kept doing it. And he protected and saved so many people. So many people, especially children. Because, children, they would get smallpox and die because they had the weaker immune systems. So this was a huge deal. And again, he kept doing it, didn't know how it worked, didn't know why it worked, but he kept doing it. So then, 50 years or so later, once again, Louis Pasteur comes along and he kind of figures out what was going on because, again, with the germ theory being proven by Robert Koch, Pasteur figured out that there must be something in the body that fights these germs. So our body has a way of, killing these germs so that we get better and we don't die from the disease. So he figured out that there was something, and again, they didn't know what this something was yet. Something in the body is able to be transferred to other people and allow them to kind of fight off this infection before it can kill them. So Louis Pasteur came up with the term vaccination, which actually comes from the Latin word vacca, meaning cow, because of the work done with Dr. Jenner and cowpox. So the word vaccine actually means cow. A lot of people don't know that. Pretty fascinating thing. So Dr. Jenner is known as the, first person to come up with a vaccine. Very, very critical to, the health of mankind. Because now we know that, if you were to take a weakened or an inactivated piece of a pathogen and inject it into someone, their immune system will build up a defense against that pathogen so that when the real bad guy comes along, your immune system is ready to fight it and kill it before it can even make you sick. And that is the foundation of vaccine technology. So very, very important. And, we owe that to Dr. Jenner. Something that's interesting, though, to keep in mind is in China, they had been doing something somewhat similar for hundreds of years. It's just nobody knew because China was shut off from the rest of the world for centuries. But what the Chinese apothecaries would do is they would actually remove the little smallpox pustules. They would actually remove them from people and grind them down into a powder, and then that powder would be ingested. So people were basically like eating little teeny tiny parts of other people's smallpox pustules. Super gross, but it worked. And people were not dying of smallpox in China for a very long time. So a lot of times you'll see, Dr. Jenner is, the Western world's vaccine developer. You'll see that a lot because, the Chinese doctors and apothecaries, they were coming up with lots of stuff, way before a lot of other things were developed in Europe later. So then, so obviously the term chemotherapy is used specifically now for cancer treatments, but back in the day, the term chemotherapy meant using any sort of chemicals in order to treat a disease. So, once again, the germ theory's been proven. We know that these little teeny tiny microscopic things can make us sick. Now we need to figure out ways of combating them so that they don't kill us. So some of the first chemicals or synthetic drugs designed to combat microbial diseases were quinine and arsenic. Now, these two chemicals are toxic, and doctors back in the late 1800s, they had to be real careful, because if the patient ingested too much of the medicine, the patient would actually die because the medicine was toxic. So you had to give the patient just the right amount in order to kill the bacteria and make them better, but not end up killing them from the drugs. So obviously some careful measurements, and people died from taking too much or being, given too much of it. So then, in the 20s and 30s, the medical community came up with sulfonamides or sulfa drugs, and sulfa drugs were looking really, really good. They really seemed to work pretty good against these infections. Then we have Dr. Alexander Fleming. So Alexander Fleming was a microbiologist. He was working with samples of staphylococci bacteria, and he was using his little petri dishes, and he was growing his bacteria, and he noticed that he had a petri dish that was contaminated by some sort of mold, some sort of fungus. And he says, oh man, this one's contaminated, I got to get rid of it. And before he threw it away, he looked at it closer, and he noticed that surrounding that mold on his petri dish was an area that was completely clear. It was completely free of bacteria. And he thought, well, this is weird, because I have bacteria all over this petri dish, except near the area where this fungus has grown. So he's like, well, I better figure out what mold this is. So he looked in his textbooks and looked at it under the microscope, and he figured out that the mold was a known species called Penicillium chrysogenum. And so the chemical produced by the fungus was called penicillin. And penicillin became the very first antibiotic, and penicillin, at the time, this was 1928, once it got going in the late 30s, early 40s, this was a miracle. There is no other way to put it than a miracle, right? So he had this contaminated petri dish, he was about to just throw it out, and he noticed that this mold produced a chemical that killed the bacteria. It obliterated the bacteria, right? So if sulfa drugs were kind of like, going up to the bacteria and just kind of beating it up until it was dead, right? Penicillin was like a nuclear bomb to the bacteria. It killed it quickly, easily, and it is said that Alexander Fleming has probably saved more human lives than any other person ever to exist. And it's actually the reason why we now have, way too many people on the planet. The human population started growing exponentially in the 30s. One of the main reasons was the development of antibiotics. Because now, families would have 10 or 12 children because half of them would die before age 3. They would die of staph and strep and, very common bacterial diseases. But now we have a way to save them. So now there aren't going to be children dying of strep throat and ear infections and common infections that babies get. They don't die anymore. So now we have these people who are still having, 10 or 12 children in the 30s and 40s, and none of them are dying because now we have medicine. We have medicine that makes them better in like one day, not a week, not a month, but they get sick, they go to the doctor, they get penicillin, and they're all better. And it really was a miracle. It was really revolutionary. All right, so we're going to go ahead and stop there because we're almost at the 15-minute mark, and then we will pick up with the rest of Chapter 1.